There are moments in war when a single explosion changes an entire front line. And then there are moments when six explosions change the fate of an entire region. Right now, that is exactly what may be unfolding around Crimea. Because in less than 48 hours, Ukraine carried out one of the most coordinated infrastructure strike campaigns of the entire war, not against airfields, not against headquarters, not even against ammunition depots. This time, Ukraine went after the arteries, the bridges. One after another, critical crossings connecting Crimea to Russian forces in southern Ukraine began disappearing from the battlefield map. First Chongar, then Henichesk, then four more bridges across the Army Perekop corridor. By the end of the operation, Russian military logistics across the southern theater had entered something dangerously close to paralysis. Convoys stopped moving, fuel routes collapsed, heavy equipment became stranded, and thousands of Russian troops suddenly found themselves trapped inside a shrinking operational pocket. What makes this operation so remarkable is not only the destruction itself, it is the sequencing, the precision, the timing. Ukraine did not randomly attack bridges. It appears Kiev deliberately forced Russian forces into alternate supply corridors, and then destroyed those corridors too, like a hunter closing every exit before the prey even realizes the trap has already been set. According to multiple open-source battlefield estimates, nearly 50,000 Russian troops positioned along southern occupied territories now face severe supply disruption. At the same time, roughly 60,000 additional Russian personnel stationed inside Crimea are becoming increasingly dependent on rapidly shrinking logistics options. That means more than 100,000 Russian troops may now be operating under the shadow of a logistical crisis, unlike anything Moscow has faced in the south for months. And the terrifying part for the Kremlin? Ukraine may not even be finished yet, because what we are witnessing is bigger than a bridge campaign. This is the possible beginning of a full-scale isolation strategy against Crimea itself. And if that strategy succeeds, the entire southern battlefield could start tilting in Ukraine's favor far faster than anyone expected. But to understand why this operation matters so much, you first have to understand how the trap was built. The first target was Chongar. For years, the Chongar crossing served as one of Russia's most essential military logistics arteries between occupied Crimea and southern Ukraine. Nearly every major supply category flowed through it at some point. Fuel tankers, artillery shells, armored vehicle components, troop rotations, food supplies, radar equipment, even air defense ammunition. In simple terms, Chongar was not just a bridge, it was a bloodstream, and Ukraine knew it. What happened next now appears to have been part of a much larger operational design. Days before the full strike sequence unfolded, Ukrainian forces reportedly tested Russian defensive reactions around the Chongar area. Surveillance drones monitored patrol patterns. Radar emissions were tracked. Electronic warfare frequencies were analyzed. Even air defense response times appear to have been carefully studied. This was not improvisation. This was preparation. Then came the strike. When Ukrainian attack drones approached the bridge, they reportedly exploited low-altitude flight corridors designed specifically to avoid Russian radar coverage. Some analysts believe electronic warfare interference may also have been used to confuse detection systems during the approach phase. By the time Russian defenses fully recognized the threat, it was already too late. Explosions ripped across the bridge structure. Traffic halted almost immediately. Russian military vehicles attempting to cross were forced to turn back, and suddenly, one of Crimea's primary logistical gateways had become unreliable. But Ukraine did not stop there. That is where the operation became truly dangerous, because once Chongar traffic collapsed, Russian logistics commanders did exactly what Ukraine expected them to do. They rerouted. The alternative route shifted toward the Henichesk crossing and the Arabat-Spit corridor, a narrow but strategically vital passage running along the coastline. Under normal conditions, this route functioned as a backup artery. Less efficient than Chongar, but still capable of moving military traffic between Crimea and southern front lines. Russian planners had long viewed it as their emergency fallback option, which is precisely why Ukraine targeted it next. The strike on Henichesk was not simply another bridge attack, it was the closure of the escape route. Reports suggest Ukrainian reconnaissance units had spent weeks studying the area before the operation. Russian patrol timings around the crossing were allegedly mapped in detail. Air defense blind spots were identified. Drone approach vectors were refined repeatedly. Everything indicates that Kyiv understood one critical reality. If Chongar fell, Russia would desperately depend on Henichesk, and that dependency created vulnerability. So on the morning following the Chongar strike, Ukrainian drones moved again. This time, the impacts hit structural weak points around the crossing itself. The damage was severe enough to halt normal transit operations almost immediately. And that changed everything. Because now Russian military convoys moving toward Zaporizhia and Kherson sectors faced a nightmare scenario. Supply routes were no longer merely threatened. They were collapsing. Fuel trucks transporting diesel for armored brigades suddenly faced massive rerouting delays. Ammunition convoys carrying artillery shells toward frontline batteries became stranded. Air defense resupply shipments slowed dramatically. Some Russian units reportedly found themselves waiting for logistics updates that never arrived. And on a modern battlefield, that is catastrophic. Wars are not won by tanks alone. They are won by fuel, by supply chains, by logistics. A tank without fuel is just metal. Artillery without shells is just noise waiting to die. And infantry without resupply eventually loses the ability to hold ground at all. That is why the destruction of Henichesk and Chongar together created such a severe operational shock. Ukraine was not attacking concrete. Ukraine was attacking momentum. The consequences spread rapidly across the southern theater. Russian formations operating near Tokmak and Melitopol suddenly faced increasing uncertainty regarding future resupply schedules. Frontline artillery units reportedly began conserving ammunition more carefully. Long-distance transport vehicles were forced onto slower and far more vulnerable alternate routes, and those alternate routes came with another enormous problem: Ukrainian drones. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, Ukraine's drone warfare capability evolved into one of the most sophisticated strike systems on the battlefield. Long-range FPV systems, autonomous navigation drones, electronic warfare-resistant platforms, and coordinated swarm tactics began transforming logistics routes into kill zones. Russian convoys traveling at night no longer enjoyed safety. In many sectors, movement itself became dangerous. Now imagine trying to reorganize an entire regional logistics system under those conditions after losing your primary bridges. That is the situation Russian commanders suddenly faced. But the most devastating phase of the operation was still coming. Because after Chongar and Henichesk were damaged, only one major land corridor capable of supporting large-scale military movement toward Crimea remained operational: the Army Perekop line. And historically, that corridor has always been dangerous. The Perekop Isthmus is one of the narrowest gateways connecting Crimea to mainland territory. In some sections, the land corridor compresses down to only a few kilometers in width. For centuries, military strategists recognized the area as both a fortress and a trap. Defenders can fortify it heavily, but if supply routes through it collapse, retreat becomes almost impossible. Russia understood this risk long ago. That is why, after 2022, Moscow transformed the corridor into a layered defensive zone filled with trenches, anti-tank barriers, dragon's teeth fortifications, artillery positions, and minefields. On paper, it looked formidable, but there was one weakness. The corridor depended on bridges, and Ukraine had already demonstrated what it intended to do to bridges. Then came the night operation. Between June 10th and June 11th, Ukrainian forces launched what may become one of the most strategically important drone attacks of the Southern War. For nearly 4 hours, waves of Ukrainian strike drones reportedly targeted critical crossings across the Army Perekop logistics chain. The strikes were coordinated, systematic, and devastatingly precise. The first bridges hit were crossings over the North Crimean Canal near Priozerny and Mirny. These structures played a major role in funneling supplies southward toward Crimea. Then additional strikes targeted the main highway bridge connected to the M17 route, a key artery used by Russian military convoys transporting heavy equipment, armored vehicles, and fuel supplies. Finally, another alternate crossing near Stavki was reportedly struck as well. In total, 6 bridges connected to Crimea had now been attacked within roughly 2 days. 6. At that point, the strategic picture began changing dramatically. Because this was no longer about isolated sabotage, this was beginning to resemble operational isolation. Crimea itself was slowly turning into a semi-contained military zone, and that possibility is terrifying for Moscow. Why? Because if land logistics continue degrading, Russia eventually becomes increasingly dependent on two alternatives: sea transport and the Kerch Bridge. Both carry enormous risks, especially in the Black Sea. Ukraine's naval drone program has evolved rapidly over the past 2 years. Sea drones capable of carrying explosives across long maritime distances have repeatedly threatened Russian naval operations and critical infrastructure. The Kerch Bridge itself has already suffered major attacks in previous operations. Even when not fully destroyed, its operational capacity has repeatedly been disrupted. That means relying heavily on Kerch now carries strategic danger, and sea-based ferry logistics are not much safer. Russian transport vessels operating in the Black Sea increasingly face threats not only from naval drones, but also from long-range missile systems and surveillance platforms. In other words, Ukraine may be trying to force Russia into a logistics structure that is slower, weaker, more predictable, and far easier to target. That is the real brilliance behind this campaign. Ukraine is not simply blowing up bridges for headlines. Ukraine appears to be redesigning the battlefield itself. And if this strategy continues successfully, the consequences for Russian frontline operations could become severe very quickly. Because once maneuver capability begins collapsing, entire defensive systems can start unraveling. And that possibility is exactly what now has military analysts watching Crimea more closely than ever before. For the first time in many months, the peninsula no longer looks untouchable. It looks exposed. And that changes everything. But perhaps the most dangerous part of this entire situation is what could happen next. Because now Ukraine has options. And every option creates new problems for Russia. To be continued. Before we continue to part 2, tell us in the comments, has Ukraine just begun the real battle for Crimea? And if you enjoy deep military analysis and battlefield breakdowns like this, subscribe to Stylish Informer so you never miss the next frontline update. But if Ukraine's bridge campaign was only the opening move, then what comes next could be the phase that truly terrifies the Kremlin. Because destroying bridges is one thing. What matters is what happens after the bridges are gone. And right now, the battlefield consequences are beginning to spread across the southern front like cracks through ice. Russian commanders now face a nightmare military equation. The further their frontline units are positioned from Crimea, the harder they become to sustain. And the harder they become to sustain, the more fragile the entire southern defense line becomes. This is especially dangerous for Russian formations operating around Tokmak, Melitopol, and the Zaporizhzhia direction. These sectors rely heavily on constant artillery support, fuel deliveries, and armored vehicle movement to maintain defensive pressure against Ukrainian assault groups. But logistics interruptions change battlefield behavior almost immediately. Artillery crews begin rationing shells, fuel convoys delay departures, armored patrols reduce movement, reserve forces become slower to reposition, and suddenly, a front line that once looked stable begins losing flexibility. That flexibility is everything in modern warfare, because wars are often decided not by who has more soldiers, but by who can move, adapt, and reinforce faster. And right now, Ukraine is trying to attack exactly that advantage, the maneuver capability of the Russian army itself. Imagine a battlefield where Russian commanders can no longer rapidly transfer ammunition between sectors. Imagine armored brigades waiting hours longer for fuel. Imagine frontline troops uncertain whether reinforcement convoys will even arrive before dawn. That kind of pressure slowly poisons an army from the inside. Morale drops, coordination weakens, reaction times slow, and eventually, defensive lines begin cracking under cumulative strain. This is why military analysts are taking these bridge strikes so seriously, because infrastructure attacks alone rarely change wars. But infrastructure attacks combined with battlefield pressure absolutely can. And Ukraine seems to understand this perfectly. Instead of launching one massive offensive assault immediately, Kiev appears to be shaping the battlefield first, cut the arteries, slow the response time, create logistical panic, force Russia into defensive exhaustion, then apply pressure where the enemy is weakest. That strategy is dangerous precisely because it does not require immediate territorial breakthroughs to succeed. It turns time itself into a weapon. Every day, Russian logistics remain disrupted, increases the pressure on frontline units. Every delayed convoy matters. Every missing artillery shipment matters. Every fuel shortage matters. And nowhere is this pressure becoming more psychologically dangerous than inside Crimea itself. Because for years, Crimea functioned as Russia's secure rear fortress, a heavily protected military sanctuary, a place where supplies could move safely, a place where commanders believed they controlled escalation. But now, that illusion is beginning to fracture. The psychological effect alone is massive. Russian personnel stationed inside Crimea are now watching the land entrances to the peninsula slowly disappear one after another. First, Chongar, then Henichesk, then the crossings near Army and Perekop. The map itself is changing in front of them, and for military planners, that creates an alarming question. What happens if Crimea becomes increasingly isolated during an active war? Because isolation changes military priorities immediately. Instead of planning future offensives, commanders begin prioritizing stockpiles, fuel reserves, ammunition conservation, emergency transport routes, bridge repair capability, fallback logistics. Everything shifts from expansion to survival. And that transition is extremely dangerous for Russia politically as well. Why? Because Crimea is not just another territory for Moscow. It is symbolic, strategic, psychological. Since 2014, the Kremlin presented Crimea as untouchable Russian ground, a permanent geopolitical victory, a cornerstone of national prestige. But now Ukraine is doing something extraordinary. It is dragging the war directly toward Crimea's doorstep again. Not with speeches, not with declarations, but with precision strikes. And that changes the emotional atmosphere of the war entirely. For years, many Russian civilians viewed Crimea as distant from frontline instability. Now supply routes are under attack, military corridors are collapsing, and defensive vulnerabilities are becoming visible to the entire world. That is not just a military problem, that is a political shockwave. But perhaps the most important question now is this: what exactly is Ukraine trying to achieve next? At this point, Kiev appears to have two possible strategic paths, and both are deeply dangerous for the Russian military. The first option is direct territorial pressure toward the Perekop Isthmus itself. In theory, if Ukraine could eventually establish sustained operational pressure near this corridor, it could threaten Russia's remaining land connection to Crimea even more aggressively. But this route carries enormous risks. The Perekop region is one of the most heavily fortified areas in the entire southern theater. Russia spent years building layered defensive systems there. Minefields stretch across key approach routes. Anti-tank fortifications cover major vehicle corridors. Artillery positions are pre-registered across likely assault zones, and the geography itself favors defenders. The narrow width of the isthmus means attacking forces would have very limited maneuver space. Any direct mechanized assault could become extraordinarily costly. Ukraine understands this, which is why many analysts believe Kiev may prefer the second strategy instead, the fire control strategy. And this approach may actually be more dangerous over time. Rather than physically occupying the corridor immediately, Ukraine can attempt to dominate it operationally. That means maintaining constant strike capability against movement through the area. Every convoy, every tanker, every transport column, every reinforcement attempt, all under permanent threat. In simple terms, Ukraine may not need to fully capture the corridor to neutralize it. It only needs to make movement through it increasingly unbearable. And modern drone warfare makes that possibility far more realistic than many people realize, especially because Ukraine's long-range strike systems continue evolving rapidly. FPV drones now operate with increasing autonomy. Naval drones threaten maritime transport. Long-range missile systems continue targeting infrastructure. Reconnaissance drones provide near-constant surveillance over frontline movement. The battlefield is becoming transparent. And transparent battlefields are nightmares for logistics, because hidden movement becomes almost impossible. This is exactly why Russian nighttime supply operations have become so difficult. Even darkness no longer guarantees safety. And once an army loses safe movement corridors, the strategic pressure becomes relentless. That pressure may soon begin affecting Russian defensive behavior across the south. Already, there are growing signs that Moscow may be forced to redistribute resources simply to stabilize logistics. More air defense systems, more engineering units, more bridge repair equipment, more convoy protection, more rear area security. All of that consumes manpower and equipment that could otherwise support offensive operations elsewhere. In other words, Ukraine may be forcing Russia into a strategic resource drain. And if that drain continues long enough, the southern front could begin tilting further in Kyiv's favor. This is why some analysts now believe the bridge campaign may become one of the most important operational developments of the year, because successful wars are often decided by systems collapse rather than dramatic battlefield charges. History proves this repeatedly. Armies rarely collapse all at once. Instead, they weaken gradually. Supply chains fail, mobility decreases, coordination slows, morale erodes. Then suddenly positions that once looked strong begin falling apart faster than expected, and Ukraine appears determined to create exactly that kind of cumulative pressure. But there is another layer to this operation that makes it even more significant. The message. Ukraine is signaling something extremely important to both Russia and the world. Crimea is no longer outside the battlefield. For a long time, the peninsula functioned almost like a protected rear zone compared to active frontline regions. Now that separation is disappearing, bridge by bridge, route by route, strike by strike. The war is moving closer. And if Ukraine successfully sustains this pressure campaign, Crimea could increasingly transform from a Russian stronghold into a logistical liability. That possibility would have sounded unbelievable earlier in the war. Now it no longer does. And the Kremlin understands that danger. Because once military logistics become unstable, political confidence follows. Questions begin emerging inside command structures. Can supply routes hold? Can reinforcements move safely? Can Crimea remain sustainable under constant pressure? Can southern operations continue at full intensity? Those questions matter enormously, especially during a prolonged war where endurance itself becomes the deciding factor. Right now, Ukraine appears to be betting that endurance is exactly where Russia can be weakened, not through one decisive battle, but through continuous operational suffocation. And if that strategy works, the consequences could eventually stretch far beyond southern Ukraine. Because Crimea is more than territory. It is the center of Russia's southern military architecture, a hub for logistics, a hub for naval operations, a hub for command structures. Pressure Crimea successfully, and pressure spreads everywhere connected to it. That is why these 6 bridges matter so much. This operation was not random destruction. It was strategic compression, a slow tightening of the battlefield around one of the most important regions in the war. And now the world is watching to see whether Russia can adapt fast enough before the pressure becomes overwhelming. Because at this moment, one reality is becoming impossible to ignore. Ukraine is no longer merely defending territory. Ukraine is actively reshaping the geometry of the war itself. The roads are narrowing, the exits are disappearing, and the southern battlefield is becoming more dangerous for Russian forces with every passing day. The coming weeks could reveal whether this bridge campaign becomes a temporary disruption or the opening phase of something much larger, perhaps even the beginning of a long-term battle for Crimea itself. But what do you think? Has Ukraine found the strategy capable of turning the southern war in its favor, or will Russia manage to stabilize the situation before the pressure becomes uncontrollable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep battlefield analysis, frontline breakdowns, and strategic war updates explained in cinematic detail, subscribe to Stylish Informer and stay ahead of every major development.